Welcome back to Tartan Lullaby. I'm Archie, and tonight there's a long, quiet story waiting for you. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find your pillow. Soften your shoulders. Let the day go. Tartan Lullaby tells slow stories of Scotland. Real places, real years, real people, told gently enough to fall asleep inside. There's no music tonight, and no need to follow every word. If you drift off in the first few minutes, the rest will play on quietly without you. That's how it's meant to be. If these stories are a quiet corner you find yourself returning to, a subscription would mean a great deal, and it helps us keep making them. The artwork you see throughout tonight's story is available as a print in our Etsy shop, if you'd like to bring a little of Scotland onto your walls. When you're ready, close your eyes and we'll begin. Tonight, the story of how Scotland invented modern football, the passing game, and the men who taught the world to play. This is Tartan Lullaby, sleep history from Scotland. Let everything slow down now. Whatever you are carrying today, set it down. You are somewhere warm. The city outside is quiet. We are going back a long way together. Glasgow, the 1860s. A Saturday evening in late summer. The light is already fading by 7. The gas lamps along the main streets are being lit one by one, the lamplighter moving at a walk. The tenements are close together here, stone walls still holding the day's warmth. Somewhere below, a door closes, footsteps on wet cobbles, the smell of coal smoke drifting down from 100 chimney stacks. This is a city building itself at speed, mills and foundries, cranes along the river, men who have come in from the countryside and from Ireland and from the Highlands, all pressed into this one tight place. In the evenings, after the work week ends, they need somewhere to go, something to do with their bodies and their time. The parks are there, the common ground, the flat stretches of grass where a ball can travel. Football exists already in a loose sense. Boys kick a ball in the street. Colleges play rough versions of the game, but the rules shift from place to place. There is no agreement on what the game actually is. That is about to change, not slowly, not through committees in London. It changes here on the south side of Glasgow in the summer of 1867 in a meeting that most of the men present probably did not think would matter very much. We are in Chapter 1 now, the beginning, Queen's Park Football Club. The date the records give is the 9th of July, 1867. A handful of men connected to the Queen's Park Recreation Ground on the south side of Glasgow gather to form a football club. There are perhaps 10 or 11 of them. They are young, mostly in their 20s. Clerks, drapers, a school teacher, men with regular working hours and Saturday afternoons free, men who read the papers and take ideas seriously. They call themselves Queen's Park Football Club after the ground where they intend to play. The name is plain and practical. There is no ceremony to it. They write their names in a book, and that is how it begins. The ground itself is in Hampton, on the south edge of the city. Open grass, no stands, no enclosure, just a pitch of sorts and the slow rise of the land around it and the sky above that. In those first weeks, they have no opponents. No other organized club exists in Glasgow to play against. So they play among themselves, dividing into two sides and working out what the game should be. This is where something important happens, because in working it out among themselves, they have to agree on everything: how many players, what the boundaries are, what constitutes a goal, what you cannot do to another man. Most football codes of the time allow you to handle the ball. Some allow hacking, meaning kicking an opponent in the shins to bring him down. Queen's Park rejects both. From the start, the ball is for feet only, and the man is not to be hurt. This is not a small decision. It shapes everything that comes after. The game they are inventing is one of movement and skill, not force. There is another decision, quieter but just as consequential. The club will be amateur. No player will be paid. The game is played for its own sake, for the pleasure and the discipline of it. That principle will hold for decades. They draw up a set of rules, simple, clear, written in the language of men who are used to organizing things. They share those rules with anyone who will read them. In the months that follow, they train together on Saturday afternoons. The pitch is often wet. The leather ball is heavy when it takes on rain. The men are learning as they go, discovering through repetition what works. And here, in the repetition, the passing game begins to emerge, not as a theory, as a practical discovery. Two men find that the ball moved between them is harder to stop than one man running with it alone. A third man receives it and finds space. The shape of the game opens up. Instead of a mob chasing a ball, there is something closer to a pattern, something almost like thought expressed in movement. They are not calling it anything yet. There is no name for it. It is just what they do on Saturday afternoons in the long, wet Scottish light on the south side of Glasgow. The club keeps records, match reports, minutes of meetings. The early documents are careful and precise, written in the hand of men who believe that what they are doing deserves to be remembered. The records suggest the first years are quiet. A small club, training in near solitude, refining a style of play that no one else is watching yet. But the style is being built carefully, game by game. By 1868 and into 1869, the situation shifts slightly. Other clubs are beginning to form in Glasgow. The game is spreading. Queen's Park starts to find opponents. Their first recorded match against another club is in 1868. The records show they win comfortably. The passing style, already practiced and embedded, is simply more effective than what the other side brings. Word moves slowly through the city. There is a club on the south side that plays a different kind of game. Smoother, less brutal. The ball stays on the ground. The men move together rather than apart. More men come to watch on Saturdays. They stand along the touchline in their coats, breath visible in autumn air, watching something they have not quite seen before. The ground after the match empties at its own pace. The players shake hands and gather their things. The spectators drift back toward the streets, back toward the tenements, and the lamplit closes. There is nothing spectacular about the walk home. Just men in dark wool moving through a city that smells of smoke and horse and river, talking quietly about what they saw. And what they saw, though they may not have had the words for it yet, was the future. A game of intelligence as much as strength. A game that could be watched as well as played because it had a shape you could follow. Queen's Park continues to grow through the early 1870s. New members, better organization. The rules they have adopted become known and respected. Other clubs begin to follow them. The club does not seek fame. That is worth holding on to. These are men who believe in the thing itself, not in what it might bring them. The amateur principle is not just policy, it is conviction. They play, they record, they refine. The game gets cleaner. The passing gets more deliberate. Players learn to read each other, to anticipate, to think one or two moves ahead. This is the intellectual quality that will later catch the world's attention. Football as a game that rewards thought. That is the Scottish contribution, and it begins here in these early Queen's Park years. The club's ground at Hampton is modest by any measure. Grass that cuts up in winter. No cover from the rain. Men standing in the open, coats buttoned, watching a game played in the same conditions they watch it in. But the modesty is part of the character. There is nothing theatrical about Queen's Park in these early years. Nothing performed. Just serious men playing a serious game as well as they can manage. By the early 1870s, something has shifted in Scottish football more broadly. The game has a critical mass. There are enough clubs, enough players, enough shared rules that something larger becomes possible. And in 1872, that something happens. The first official international football match. Scotland against England. A game that will be remembered for a long time, for reasons the men who played it may not have predicted. But we will arrive there slowly. There is no hurry. The night is long and the story has room. For now, settle into this moment. Glasgow in the early 1870s, the city still building, smoke from 100 stacks above the rooflines. A Saturday afternoon light, low and grey, the kind that makes the green of a pitch look almost luminous. Queen's Park has been playing for 5 years. The founding members are a few years older, a little more certain of what they are doing. The club has a reputation now, modest but real. New players come through, young men who grew up in the city and learned to kick a ball in the streets. They arrive at Hampton and discover a different kind of game. A game with a grammar to it. A good pass is a pleasure to receive. The ball arriving where you expected it, at the weight you can manage, without breaking your stride. There is a satisfaction to it that you do not find in the scrambling game other clubs play. The players begin to understand each other without speaking. A movement in one direction draws a man away and opens space in another. This is taught not in theory, but in repetition, in the doing of it, until it becomes instinct. The park empties slowly after training. The last men walk out through the gate in twos and threes. The grass holds the marks of their afternoon. Churned mud near the goals, softer ground in the middle, the evidence of where the game was played. The lamp on the road outside is already lit. It casts a circle of yellow light on the wet stones. The men pass through it and are gone back into the city, back into their weeks. Let that image rest. The empty ground, the single lamp, the marks in the mud where the game has been. This is where something very old begins. Not the sport as spectacle, not the industry it becomes later. Just men, a ball, and a set of principles worked out among themselves on a wet Saturday afternoon in Glasgow. They did not know they were inventing anything. That is probably the most honest thing you can say about it. They were solving a practical problem. How do you play a good game? And the answer they found was good enough to travel. Good enough to travel to England, where it was watched with curiosity and then adopted. Good enough to carry across Europe with the men who moved there for work. Good enough to persist for 150 years and more. But all of that is later. For now, the city is quiet. The pitch is empty. The men who played on it have gone home to their suppers and their fires. Glasgow at night, 1870. Gaslight on wet stone. The River Clyde running dark and wide a mile to the north. The sound of the city settling after the week into something near stillness. You are here in this moment, the smoke above the rooftops, the cold air, the smell of stone and rain. Nothing is rushing, nothing needs to hurry. The story will continue. The international match, the passing game spreading, the men who carried it abroad, all of that is still ahead, but not yet. For now, just Glasgow, just the beginning. A club of serious young men on the south side of the city, playing a game they believed in the quiet before the world was watching. Let your breathing slow. The story is here with you. There is nothing to chase and nowhere to be. Just the cold air and the lamplight and the long, slow beginning of something that changed the world. Rest now, we will carry on from here. It is the last day of November, 1872. The city of Glasgow is cold. The Clyde sits grey and heavy. Smoke from 1,000 chimneys lays itself flat over the rooftops of Partick. The streets smell of coal and wet stone. There are two countries playing a game of association football today. One of them invented it. The other thinks it knows better how to play it. Both believe they are right. The ground is a cricket field in the West End. The West of Scotland cricket ground at Hamilton Crescent, Partick. It has been loaned out for the afternoon. The grass is short and hard. Frost is still in it along the shadow of the pavilion wall. 4,000 people have come. They line the edges of the pitch in long coats and tall hats. Their breath rises in small clouds. Nobody is moving quickly. The cold has settled into boots and collars. People stand close together for warmth they will not admit they need. Scotland have played England before, in a manner of speaking. There were 5 matches claimed as internationals in the years before this one, but those were scratch affairs, contested on English soil, with English selected players on both sides. Scotland had no team. Scotland had no say. This match is different. This time the Scottish Football Association has selected the Scotland side. This time the players wearing dark blue are Scotsmen playing for Scotland. It is the first real international football match the world has ever seen. The England side has travelled north. They are fit and capable men. They play the game the way it is played in the English public schools. One man takes the ball, runs hard with it, and the others follow behind him in a pack, waiting to pick up the pieces. Scotland's team is drawn almost entirely from one club. 8 of the 11 men on the field in dark blue are Queen's Park players. They know each other. They have trained together. They have a shared understanding about how the game might be played differently. The Queen's Park men have been working on something, not a trick or a special move, something more fundamental than that. A different idea about the ball, about space, about what a team actually means on a field of play. The match begins in the early afternoon. The light is already low. November in Glasgow does not offer much of it. The shadows of the pavilion are stretching out across the near touchline before the first half is even properly underway. England move the ball in the way that England move the ball. One man drives forward, head down, legs working. His teammates cluster at his back. The play advances in a lump, then stalls, then starts again elsewhere. It is physical and determined, and it works often enough. Scotland do something else. A Queen's Park man receives the ball, and instead of running with it, he passes it sideways to a teammate who is in space. That man moves the ball on before a defender reaches him. A third man collects it further up the field. The people on the touchlines watch this carefully. Some of them have seen hundreds of football matches. They have never seen passing like this, not as a system, not as a shared understanding between a whole side. It looks, to some of them, almost strange. The ball travels along the ground in short, careful movements. It moves faster than any one man can carry it. The English defenders find themselves chasing a ball that is never quite where they expected it to be. The Queen's Park men are always one step away from where the press arrives. England push hard. They have strong and experienced men. The ball reaches dangerous positions. The Scotland goalkeeper and his defenders hold their shape. The game goes back and forth. Neither side can find the decisive moment. The cold afternoon deepens. By the second half, the light is going soft at the edges. Not dark yet, but the quality of it has changed. The far end of the pitch is dimmer. Scarves and overcoats in the crowd have become shapes more than colors. People have stopped stamping their feet. The Scotland passing holds. 8 men who have played together week after week in the leagues and friendlies of Glasgow have built something that cannot easily be dismantled in a single afternoon, even by a strong English side with determination and size. There are moments of real danger at both ends. Goalmouth scrambles, long drives, headers that come close. The records suggest neither goalkeeper is entirely idle, but neither side can convert their chances. The tension is never given voice. It sits in the cold air like the frost that never quite lifted. The final whistle sounds. The score is 0-0. The match is drawn. 4,000 people on the perimeter begin, slowly and without urgency, to move. 0-0 is not nothing. 0-0 in this case is the result of Scotland holding their own against the country that wrote down the rules. 0-0 with this method and on this day is something that will matter later, though nobody on the field knows it yet. The players shake hands. The crowd does not surge. There is no great surge in this crowd. People button their coats and turn. The thing that just happened was significant in ways that will only become clear over years and decades. In the moment, it was a good game of football on a cold afternoon. The Queen's Park men gather near the pavilion. They are cold and tired and satisfied. 8 of them have represented their country for the first time. They played together as they always play. They did not do anything today that they had not done on the Hampton fields of a Tuesday evening. England's players collect their things. They are not humiliated. A draw away from home in these conditions is not nothing, but something happened on the pitch that the English football men will think about on the train south. A different kind of game, a different relationship between players and the ball. The crowd disperses into Partick. This is a working neighborhood, streets of stone tenements, the smell of the river not far off. People walk in ones and twos, collars up, hands in pockets. The conversations are quiet. It has been a long, cold afternoon. The gaslit street lamps are coming on along Crow Road and the lanes around it. Not all at once. One at a time, the lamplighter moving unhurried through the November dark, touching each one into a small orange bloom that makes the surrounding dark look deeper. A few men stop outside a public house to finish their conversation. What did you make of that passing? You could see what they were doing, whether it works against stronger opposition, whether it works when the other side has learned to read it. These conversations do not resolve. They trail off into the cold. The Hamilton Crescent ground is emptying. A groundskeeper walks the perimeter. The marks in the grass from 4,000 pairs of feet are visible even in the fading light, a dark band all the way around where the crowd stood. The center of the pitch is pale and undamaged by spectators. The pavilion windows are lit. Inside, both teams are changing, eating, talking. The cold that was in their boots and their legs is beginning to ease with warmth and rest. Outside, the evening is fully arrived. The frost is coming back down into the grass. A man walks home along the canal path west of Partick. He was at the match. He is thinking about the passing. He cannot quite put his finger on what made it feel different. It was something about the ball moving to where the space was, not where the player wanted to go. He will not write this down. He will not explain it to anyone tonight. But the image of it will stay with him, the dark blue shirts, the short passes along the frozen ground, the English defenders always half a beat behind. He will think of it again in the spring, watching a local match, wondering why they do not try it. The Clyde is black now under the November sky. The gas lamps make long, pale reflections on the water where it passes under the bridge. A cart goes by. The sound of the horses' hooves on the cobblestones carries a long way in the cold quiet, then silence. Somewhere on the south side, the Queen's Park men are traveling home. They will have their own conversations. They will have their own sense of what was accomplished today. They held a country at 0-0 with their passing game. They did not lose. They did not falter. The west of Scotland cricket ground sits empty in the dark. No lights remain on in the pavilion now. The pitch is invisible. The boundary where 4,000 people stood is invisible. In the morning, there will be frost everywhere, and the marks in the grass will be stiff and pale. This match will be written about in the newspapers tomorrow. The correspondent from one Glasgow paper will note that the Scotland side played a combination game, passing accurately to one another, that was quite different from the English style. He will not quite know yet what he has witnessed. In London, in the offices of the Football Association, someone will read that match report. The passing game, the combination game, the organized movement of the ball between teammates. They will file it away. It will come back to them. It will come back to many people. But tonight, Partick is quiet. The last walkers have gone indoors. The gas lamps burn steadily in the empty streets. A cat moves along a wall somewhere. The Clyde runs. The cold deepens toward midnight. Somewhere in the city, a Scottish football player is already asleep. He played today. He ran and passed and held his position and was part of something larger than himself. Tomorrow he will go back to work. Next week he will train again with his club. The game goes on. The match at Hamilton Crescent was the first. There will be more. The two nations will meet again and again over the coming years and decades, and with each meeting the Scottish passing game will be refined and tested and adapted. But it started here, on a cold cricket field, on the last day of November. The city does not know yet what it has given the world. It is just Glasgow on a winter night, with its smoke and its stone and its river. The lamps burn. The streets are empty. The frost is white on the cobblestones by the water. Everything is still. The ball moves across the grass. One man receives it. He does not run with it. He looks up, finds a teammate, and plays it on. The man who played it is already moving into space. This is not instinct. This is something learned, drilled, argued over on cold evenings in Glasgow until it becomes second nature. Queen's Park in the late 1860s are a small club. Their players are clerks and students, bookkeepers and apprentices. They are not the biggest men on the field. They are not the fastest. What they have is each other. The English game at this point is a man's game in the most literal sense. One man takes the ball. He lowers his head and runs. He uses his body to shield it, to barge through, to force a path. It is direct. It is physical. It is effective up to a point. But the Queen's Park men watch that game and they ask a quiet question. What happens when you are smaller than the man trying to stop you? What happens when force is not your weapon? The answer they find is geometry. The ball can move faster than any man. The ball does not tire. The ball does not feel the cold. If you can move the ball, you do not need to carry it. This sounds simple. It is not. To pass the ball, you must trust the man you are passing to. You must believe he will be where you expect him. You must have practiced this exact moment so many times that the trust is automatic. In the early 1870s, Queen's Park begin to train differently. They rehearse movements. They talk about where to stand when a teammate has the ball. They develop habits as a unit. Individual brilliance is still welcome, but it is in service of something larger. The pitch at Hampden Park, their home in those years, is often damp. The grass holds moisture from the west of Scotland rain. The ball is heavy leather, dark with mud by the second half. On a wet day, dribbling that ball through mud and bodies is exhausting work. But a pass needs only one good touch. The ball skids across the surface. It arrives at a man's feet in a different part of the field entirely, where there is perhaps more space, perhaps less pressure. The wet ground, so hostile to the dribbler, suits the passing game. This is not coincidence. The Scottish climate shapes the game. The conditions that make the long dribble a struggle are the same conditions that reward the short pass. The weather is almost a coach. The combination game, as it comes to be called, requires a specific kind of intelligence. A player must hold in his mind not just where the ball is, but where his teammates are, where the opposition is, and where the empty spaces are opening and closing. It is a moving picture, constantly updating. The man who can read it and act on it in the fraction of a second before the picture changes has something that no amount of size or speed can fully replace. Queen's Park attract that kind of player. The club's culture selects for it. A young man who loves to think as well as run finds a home there. The dribbler who wants only the ball at his own feet does not last long. By the early 1870s, the combination game is the foundation of Queen's Park's identity. When they travel to play teams from the south of Scotland, or when visitors come to Glasgow to face them, the difference is visible immediately. The visiting team presses forward in ones and twos, each man with the ball trying to carry it as far as he can. The Queen's Park men move like a unit, the ball shifting sideways and forward, the pattern always shifting, always just ahead of where the opposition expects it. After the 1872 International, the England players speak with genuine puzzlement about what they faced. It is not that their opponents were faster or stronger. It is that the ball kept appearing somewhere they had not predicted. There was a logic to it they could not quite follow. The Queen's Park approach spreads because it wins. In the early years of the Scottish Cup, which begins in 1874, the clubs that do best are the ones who have watched Queen's Park and learned from them. Vale of Leven in the west are among the first. Vale of Leven come from Alexandria, a mill town on the river Leven near Loch Lomond. The river runs dark in winter, the mills working through the short days. The football club forms from the same working community, and it adopts the combination game as its own. The Vale players are wiry and quick. They communicate on the pitch with the familiarity of men who work alongside each other, who grew up in the same streets. The passing game suits them. The trust it requires already exists. In the Scottish Cup of 1877, Vale of Leven win the trophy. They beat Rangers in the final. The passing game, this particular Scottish invention, has now travelled beyond the club that created it. It belongs to the country. Dumbarton, another west of Scotland club, develop along similar lines. Their home is the town at the mouth of the River Leven, where it meets the Clyde. The river is wide and grey in the mornings. The Castle Rock stands above the water. Dumbarton in the late 1870s and early 1880s are among the strongest clubs in Scotland. They share the first official Scottish League championship in 1891 with Rangers. Their game is built on combination. The ball moves, the men move, the system holds. The Scottish Cup in its early years is not just a competition, it is a laboratory. Clubs from different towns bring different interpretations of the combination game. They learn from each other in the matches themselves. After the final whistle, players sometimes talk, watch how the other side did things. The game is being refined in public, in real competition, under real pressure. Every season adds something. A new way of rotating positions, a new understanding of how far forward a defender can safely venture, a new rhythm to the passing sequences. There is an argument, made quietly by some historians, that football in Scotland becomes genuinely collective in a way that football in England does not yet. The Scottish game at this period trusts the group. The English game still trusts the individual. This is a cultural difference as much as a tactical one. The industrial communities of Western Scotland, the mill towns and shipyard towns and mining towns, are communities in the deepest sense. Collective effort is not an abstract idea. It is survival. A man passes the ball because he trusts his teammate. He trusts his teammate because he knows him. He knows him because they live the same life, work the same hours, walk home on the same roads. The football is an extension of that life. Queen's Park, unusually, are an amateur club in a period when professionalism is beginning to creep into English football. Their players receive no wages. They play for the game itself. This gives the passing game a particular quality. There is no individual incentive to keep the ball. A man who keeps the ball to show off his dribbling earns nothing extra. He is not playing for a contract, so when the right pass is available, he makes it. The collective style is reinforced by the absence of individual reward. This will become complicated later, when professionalism arrives in Scotland too. But in the 1870s and into the 1880s, the amateur ethic at Queen's Park is part of what makes the combination game so pure. The ball in this era is different from the ball of later years. It is heavier when wet. It does not carry well through the air over long distances. The long diagonal pass, the technique that will become common much later, is not yet reliable. So the passing game that Scotland develops is a short passing game. The ball moves from foot to foot across short distances. The players are close together, talking, adjusting, shifting. The pattern is dense and intricate. A defender watching from distance might see it as a kind of weaving. The ball disappears into a knot of players and emerges somewhere unexpected. There is no straight line. There is a search for the gap, and when the gap is found, the ball goes through it. The men who play this game do not look heroic in the way the great dribbler looks heroic. They do not surge forward alone against opposition, ball at their feet, crowd holding its breath. The combination game does not produce that moment. What it produces is different. A sequence of passes that ends in a goal feels inevitable after the fact. Each pass was the right decision, and the right decisions added up to something that could not be stopped. The beauty is in the accumulation. Not everyone understands it at first. Watching from the terracing, a supporter used to the dribbling game sees the ball moved sideways and thinks, why not forward? Why give it to a man who is going nowhere? The answer only becomes clear when the sequence continues. The supporters learn to watch differently. They learn to see the whole picture rather than just the ball. They begin to appreciate the run made without the ball, the space opened by a movement in the opposite direction. They become educated in the game. This is part of what the combination game does for Scottish football. It creates a watching culture that is genuinely analytical. Supporters argue about tactics in a way that would have been unusual in English grounds at the same period. The game makes thinkers of its audience. On a Saturday afternoon in November, the crowd on the terracing at a Scottish ground is wrapped against the cold. Breath rises in small clouds. The grass below is pale and hard. The light comes from the southwest, low and flat, already going by 3 in the afternoon. The ball moves, short pass, the third man checking his shoulder, receiving, releasing. The pattern shifts. A man overlaps on the right. The ball finds him. He crosses early. The pattern continues. There are no individual acts in this moment. There is only the system. After the game, the terracing empties slowly. The crowd spills out into the streets, into the early dark. The gaslight at the corner is already lit. 2 men in heavy coats walk home together, replaying a particular passage of play, arguing about when the move should have been released. This is a conversation that happens all over the city, all over the west of Scotland, every Saturday. The combination game has given people something to argue about that requires genuine understanding. It is not just, was it a good goal? It is, was it the right decision at the right moment? Other Scottish clubs study Queen's Park not just by playing them, but by watching them. In the 1870s, attending a Queen's Park match to learn is not unusual. The club is open about what they are doing. They believe in the game, in football, as something worth improving. The records suggest that Queen's Park players sometimes explained their system to curious opponents after matches. There is no secrecy. The combination game is not a trick to be hidden. It is a philosophy to be shared. This generosity is part of why it spreads. By the early 1880s, the passing game is so embedded in Scottish football that it is simply how the game is played. Young men learning football in Glasgow or Dumbarton or Vale of Leven do not learn the dribbling game. They learn to pass from the beginning. A boy on a street in Partick or Govan, kicking a ball against a wall with 3 or 4 friends, learns instinctively to look for the spare man. The game he is playing is already shaped by the combination principle, even if he has never heard the term. The game becomes Scotland's dialect of football. Just as a language develops regional sounds and rhythms and ways of putting words together, the football that Scotland plays has its own particular quality. You can see it in the first moments of any match. The ball moves differently. When English observers begin to notice this, in the 1870s and through the 1880s, they use the phrase "the Scottish game" with a mixture of respect and puzzlement. It is the same game, played under the same rules, on a similar pitch, but it is not the same game at all. The difference is philosophy. The English game says, one man, the ball, the opponent, resolve it by force or skill. The Scottish game says, one man with the ball is already thinking about where the ball should be next, and the man who should receive it is already moving. This is the combination game stated plainly, but stating it plainly does not capture it. Watching it does. Standing on a terrace at a Queen's Park match in 1879, in the cold, with the ball moving through the grey afternoon air from white shirt to white shirt, you understand something that words struggle to contain. The Vale of Leven players bring the combination game into the Scottish Cup final, and they play it at its best under pressure. When the occasion is highest, when the final whistle is closest, the combination holds. The trust does not fail. The pass is still the right answer. This is what pressure tests. Any team can pass the ball when the game is easy and the result is settled. The Scottish clubs of this period pass when it is hard, when a mistake will be punished, when the temptation to hold the ball and protect it is strongest. The decision to pass rather than hold is a decision made in a fraction of a second, at a moment of genuine stress. The fact that Scottish players make it consistently, correctly, in the hardest moments, is what gives the combination game its reputation. By the mid-1880s, Scottish clubs begin to export their players to England. Professional football is spreading south, and English clubs want men who can play the combination game. The Scotch Professors, as they come to be called, carry the system with them. But that is the next chapter. For now, the game belongs to Scotland. The cold grounds of the West, the passing rhythms developed on damp November pitches, the trust built through years of practice and common life. The ball moves from man to man in the grey afternoon light. The ground empties at the end. The players walk off the pitch, breath clouding in the cold. The terracing clears from the top down, the rows of men stepping down toward the exits, talking. The gaslight comes on in the street outside. The last of the crowd is gone. The pitch is empty. The nets, if there are nets, hang still. The ball is inside. The day is almost dark. What was played here this afternoon will be talked about until the week turns and the next match comes. Scotland has made something, not just a way of playing football, but a way of thinking about it. A game that belongs to a whole community rather than to the individual who happens to hold the ball at any moment. It is a small thing in one sense. In another sense, it is not small at all. The rain comes in from the west, as it always does. The pitch darkens. The lights in the houses around the ground come on one by one. The city settles into the evening. The combination game rests until Saturday. The best Scottish players face a choice in the 1880s. Stay amateur, play for the love of it, follow the Queen's Park model, or accept the coin being quietly offered by clubs south of the border. For many, the decision is not difficult. There are families to feed and futures to build. England legalizes professionalism in 1885. Scotland does not follow for another 8 years. In that gap, the traffic begins. Players who might once have spent their whole careers in Glasgow or Dundee now find themselves on trains heading to Preston, Blackburn, Sunderland, Aston Villa. They carry something with them beyond a kit bag. They carry the passing game. The short, controlled style worked out on the Glasgow Commons and in the Queen's Park drill sessions. A way of playing that most English clubs are still discovering. Preston North End in the late 1880s is more than half Scottish. The records name Geordie Drummond, David Russell, John Gordon, Jimmy Ross. The manager, a Scot himself, builds the side around movement and combination. Preston go through the 1888 to 1889 season without losing a league match. They call it the Invincibles. The name sticks because nothing like it has been seen before in the English game. What makes them is not pace or power alone. It is the thread of passes connecting one man to the next, the timing, the trust. All of it traced back to a tradition that started by the Clyde. The men who travel south become known as the Scotch Professors. The name is half admiring, half ironic, as English nicknames often are. But the content of the lesson is real. They teach by doing. Every match is a demonstration. Some stay, some move again. The world is opening up to the game faster than anyone expects, and Scots are near the front of almost every advance. The shipping lanes that carry Glasgow's iron and steel also carry men who know how football should be played. John Tate Robertson goes to Chelsea in the early 1900s and then to Glossop, coaching and influencing as he moves. Alexander Watson Hutton sails to Argentina in 1882, initially to teach at the Buenos Aires English High School. He brings a ball. Within a decade, he is founding clubs and running the first Argentine Football Association. Hutton is not alone. The names scatter across the shipping records and club histories of South America. Some go to Uruguay, some to Brazil. In each place, the Scottish influence plants itself in the same way: short passes, movement off the ball, teamwork over individual display. In Central Europe, the pattern repeats. John Madden, a centre-forward from Dumbarton, coaches in Prague for decades. He is credited with shaping the Bohemian and later Czechoslovak footballing tradition. He settles there, learns the language, becomes part of the city. The game he brought from the Clyde outlasts him. Jimmy Hogan is English by birth, but his footballing education is Scottish in spirit. He coaches in Holland, Austria, Hungary. The Hungarian football that astonishes Europe in the 1950s traces one of its lines of descent back through Hogan and threw him back to the combination game. There is no monument to this, no single point where you can stand and say, here is where it crossed the sea. It happens in training sessions and friendly matches, in coaching manuals passed between hands, in the way a young player watches an older professional control and release the ball. The grass at Hampton and Ibrox and Celtic Park and the old recreation ground at Partick holds none of this in memory. But somewhere in the way the game is played on 6 continents, a faint signal persists, a preference for the pass, a belief that the ball should move faster than any man can run. By the time the 20th century opens, Scotland is a small country that has sent its game almost everywhere. The Scotch Professors are aging now. Some are buried abroad. In cities they arrived at young and never left. The ground quiets around their memory. The night settles over the story for a moment. Let it. The ships have left the harbour. The lessons are given. The game is loose in the world. There is time to breathe before we come back to Glasgow and the century that made it. We return to the 1870s and 1880s. The city is growing faster than it can comfortably hold. The population of Glasgow doubles and then doubles again across the Victorian decades. The tenements go up in red and grey sandstone. The shipyards on the Clyde work day and night. The working week is long, 6 days in most trades, but Saturday is changing. A movement for the Saturday half-day gains ground through the 1870s. By the 1880s, many workers finish at noon or 1 o'clock. Several free hours open up before dark. Men look for something to do with them. Football is ready. It has been ready, waiting for exactly this moment. The pitches exist. The clubs exist. The rules exist. What football has been lacking is a reliable audience with time to watch it. The Saturday half-day provides one. The terraces fill, not the grand concrete structures that come later, but wooden boards, cinder banking, men standing shoulder to shoulder in their working coats. Breath rising in the cold November air. The gas lamps of the city glowing pale behind the rooftops as the afternoon drains away. This is the crowd that makes professional football possible in Scotland. Not wealthy patrons, not gentlemen subscribers, working men spending a few pennies of their wages on 90 minutes of something that is entirely theirs. Something that happens on a field they can see from their street. The clubs that form in this period are not invented from above. They grow from communities, from churches and workplaces and neighborhoods and shared backgrounds. The story of Celtic and the story of Rangers are both, at their roots, stories of people looking for belonging. Rangers form first. The year is 1872. A group of young men from the Gairloch, a long, narrow sea loch northwest of Glasgow, are living and working in the city. They play football on Glasgow Green, the open common ground by the river. The records say there are 4 of them initially: Moses MacNeil, Peter MacNeil, Peter Campbell, William Macbeth. They name the club after a team they have read about in an English rugby almanac. The name has a military ring that appeals to them. They are young, they are far from home, they are making something out of almost nothing on a public field by the Clyde. The early Rangers have no ground, no money, no colours fixed yet. They play friendly matches against other newly formed clubs, some of which will themselves survive and grow, many of which will dissolve within a few years. The landscape of Victorian football is crowded with clubs that flare briefly and go out. Rangers survive. They find a ground at Kinning Park. They attract players and members. By the 1880s, they are among the leading clubs in the country, alongside Queen's Park and Vale of Leven and Dumbarton. They become tenants at Ibrox in 1887, on ground that will be rebuilt and expanded over the decades into the stadium that stands today. The story of Celtic begins differently. The date is 1887, moving into 1888. The setting is the East End of Glasgow, a district shaped heavily by Irish immigration. Families have been coming from Ireland for decades, driven first by the famine years of the 1840s and then by the continuing poverty of rural Ulster and Connaught. The community is settled but poor. Brother Walfrid is a Marist teaching brother, Irish-born, working in the East End parishes. He sees what football is doing for other communities. He sees the funds that match receipts can generate. He proposes a new club, explicitly created to raise money for the poor of the East End parishes. The founding meeting takes place in November 1887 in St. Mary's Church Hall in the Colton. The club is named Celtic. The name reaches back to the Irish and Scottish Gaelic heritage shared by the community it serves. The first match is played in May 1888 on a new ground at Parkhead. From the beginning, Celtic is a club with a purpose beyond football. The early records show charitable distributions, meals for children, support for families in difficulty. The football generates the income. The income goes to the community. It is a practical arrangement with a warm intention behind it. Celtic recruit well in the early years. They bring in players from across Scotland and from the Irish community. The quality is high enough to win them early recognition as one of the country's best sides. Within a few years, they are competing with and sometimes beating the established clubs. Rangers and Celtic play their first match against each other in 1888. It is, at that point, simply a local derby between two Glasgow clubs of roughly equal standing. The weight the fixture will later carry is entirely invisible to anyone watching that first game. Two young clubs, a spring afternoon, a result that the records preserve. The city holds both clubs. In the 1880s and 1890s, the rivalry is part of the fabric of Glasgow football, without yet being the defining fact of Scottish football. There are other great clubs. Dumbarton win the first two Scottish League titles. Hearts and Hibs in Edinburgh have their own histories, their own communities. But Glasgow is the gravitational centre. The density of population, the concentration of industry, the Saturday crowds, the availability of talent from the shipyards and engineering works all make it so. The city generates players faster than any other place in Scotland. On a Saturday afternoon in the 1890s, you can walk from one end of Glasgow to the other and pass half a dozen grounds, each one drawing its own crowd, men in flat caps and long coats, boys pressed against the front of the terrace banking, the smell of pipe smoke and damp wool. The matches finish, the crowds thin, men walk home through streets that are beginning to light up with gas, the public houses open, the conversations start, who scored, whether the referee was fair, what the first team needs to do better next week. Football has become the shared language of the city. There is something quiet about the way these clubs embed themselves. No announcement, no declaration. They simply become part of what Glasgow is. The way the river is part of it, and the shipyards, and the stone tenements stacked up the hillsides above the smoke. Celtic's Parkhead ground is in a neighbourhood of brick terraces and small shops. On match days, the streets around it fill early. Women as well as men, though the terraces are mostly male. Children running ahead. The smell of the river somewhere behind everything, carried on the westerly wind. Rangers at Ibrox are a few miles away, on the south side, in a district of similar character. Working streets, corner shops. The sound of the yard whistles still in people's ears from the morning. Football on a Saturday afternoon is the agreed-upon counterweight to everything the week has cost. These two clubs are not yet enemies in the way they will later be understood. They are neighbours in a city large enough to hold them both. The heat comes later, fed by forces that are political and religious and historical all at once. In the 1880s and 1890s, the ember is small. There are other stories in the city at the same time. Third Lanark and Clyde and Partick Thistle are all established, all drawing their own communities. Queen's Park remain a force, still amateur, still providing the backbone of the Scottish international side. The league is young and contested. The Scottish Football League forms in 1890, 2 years after the English equivalent. 11 clubs at the start, Rangers and Celtic both founding members. The records of those first seasons show the competition is real. Dumbarton and Rangers share the first title. The result is disputed and shared because the points finish level. 11 clubs become more. The lower divisions fill with the clubs of smaller towns and larger villages. Motherwell and Hamilton and Airdrie and Falkirk, each with their own ground, their own following, their own small rivalries. Scottish football spreads into the country as well as concentrating in the city. The nights draw in early in October. The grounds are cold by 4 o'clock. The players' boots leave dark prints in the mud of the goalmouth. The gaslight flickers at the edge of the field. The crowd stands in the gathering dark, watching the last few minutes of a match that will be talked about all week. This is the texture of Victorian football in Scotland. Not glamour, not spectacle, something more durable than either. Community, repetition, the reliable return of the same thing week after week through rain and frost and the short northern days. The clubs become institutions. They outlast the men who founded them. They outlast the players who filled their first rosters. They become part of the inheritance of the city, passed from one generation to the next, without any formal ceremony. A grandfather takes a grandson to his first match. The tradition continues without anyone deciding to continue it. Glasgow at the turn of the century is one of the great industrial cities of the world. It builds ships that sail every ocean. It makes steel and locomotives and thread and tobacco. It is wealthy at its center and grinding at its edges. It holds all of this together in the grid of its streets. And it holds football. The game is everywhere now, played in the parks and back courts by boys who have watched the professionals, discussed in the works canteen on Monday morning, the subject of newspaper columns and arguments that last all week. It is woven into the life of the city in ways that are hard to separate out. The founders of Celtic are mostly gone by the time the 20th century begins. Brother Walfrid leaves Glasgow in 1892, reassigned to London by his order. The club he created is by then self-sustaining. It no longer needs him in the same way. He dies in 1915 in a Marist house in Essex, far from Parkhead. The four young men from the Gaelic who formed Rangers on Glasgow Green in 1872 become, in time, historical figures. Their names are on plaques and in records. Moses MacNeill, who some historians credit as the principal founder, dies in 1938. He has seen his club grow from a handful of boys on a public field to one of the largest in Scotland. The clubs outlive their origins. They grow into something their founders could not have anticipated. But in the 1880s and 1890s, they are simply two young football clubs in a growing city, each rooted in a community, each trying to build something that lasts. Let the city settle now. The factories are quiet on a Sunday, the yards are still. The streets around Parkhead and Ibrox are empty and cold. The grounds wait in the grey morning light, the grass marked with the wear patterns of the week before. Inside the city, tens of thousands of people carry the game with them into the rest of their lives. It is in the results they check in the Monday paper, in the conversation that starts when two strangers discover they support the same club, in the arguments and the loyalties and the small ceremonies of belonging. Football has done something that industry and religion and politics each tried to do in their own way. It has given a very large, very mixed, very overworked city a shared set of stories. Not the same stories for everyone, but stories that connect. The century turns. The Victorian era ends. The clubs that formed in the 1870s and 1880s are now heading into their second and third decades. Some of the men who played in those early matches are still alive, watching a game that has grown far beyond what they knew. The great managers are still in the future. Shankly and Busby and Stein and Ferguson are not yet born. Their story belongs to the next chapter and the chapter after that. For now, it is enough to hold the earlier moment. The passing game invented in a park by the river, the Scotch Professors carrying it south and across the world, the clubs rooted in Glasgow's East End and South Side, growing quietly in the smoke. Close your eyes for a moment on Victorian Glasgow, the gaslight on the wet cobblestones, the last supporters filing out of a ground at dusk, the sound of a distant shipyard clock marking the hour. The city going on around the football and the football going on inside the city. The terraces empty slowly. Men walk in ones and twos along the streets toward home. Their voices are low now. The match is over. The week begins again tomorrow. But for a few hours on a Saturday afternoon, something happened on a muddy field in Glasgow that will not easily be undone. The story of Scottish football is still being made, but its foundations are here in these decades, in the amateurs of Queen's Park who decided that football was worth playing properly, in the first international on a Wednesday afternoon in November, in the passing game that spread like a current from the Clyde outward across the world. Let the rain come down softly on the old grounds, on the grass of Glasgow Green where Rangers first kicked a ball, on the streets of the Colton where Celtic was conceived in a church hall on a November evening, on the training fields where the Scotch professors learned what they would later teach. Rest now, the history is laid down, the clubs are built, the game is given to the world. There is nothing left to do tonight but let it all grow quiet. The stone is cold, the lamps are out, the river moves in the dark below the city, carrying everything toward the sea. The game left Glasgow, that is the simplest way to say it. The men who had learned it on the back streets and the ash pitches carried it with them, and wherever they went, the game thought differently afterwards. But the tradition did not only travel in boots, it traveled in minds. Some of those minds came from the ground itself, from the coal seams and the shipyards, and the terrace rose where the smoke never quite left the curtains. Men who understood work as a physical argument with the world, and who brought that understanding to football. Bill Shankly was born in Glenbuck in 1913. The village sat in the hills of Ayrshire, a small knot of stone houses around a colliery. The population was never large. The winters were long. The men worked underground and the boys played football on the rough ground between the rows. Glenbuck produced footballers the way other places produce nothing at all. Something in the air, people said, though the air was not particularly clean. Something in the culture, in the way the game was passed from fathers to sons, the way the pit work was passed, as a serious thing, a thing worth doing well. Shankly's uncles played. His brothers played. He grew up understanding that football was not recreation. It was expression. It was what a man from a place like Glenbuck could do with the intelligence and the will that the pit would otherwise swallow whole. He went to Carlisle United at 17. He went because the pit was the alternative and because he was good enough to go. The journey out of Glenbuck was short in miles and long in everything else. He never forgot where he came from. He never wanted to. The conviction Shankly carried was simple and absolute. Football belonged to the working man, not as entertainment handed down from above, but as the working man's own art, his own theatre, his own argument with the world. A manager's job was to give that back to the people who needed it. He went to Liverpool in 1959. The club was in the second division, the ground was in some disrepair, the training facilities were, by polite accounts, basic. He stood at Anfield and saw what it could be. The certainty in him was not arrogance, it was Glenbuck. The players who worked under him remembered the directness of it, the way he stripped tactics to their essentials, the way he believed in passing, in movement, in the collective over the individual. These were not ideas he had invented. They were ideas he had inherited, distilled, made his own. The tradition ran through him the way a seam runs through stone. You could see it if you knew where to look. The short pass, the support run, the intelligence of the team as a whole outweighing the brilliance of any single part. Glenbuck itself is gone now, the colliery closed, the houses were cleared. There is a memorial there, a small thing in the grass, and the hills beyond it are quiet. The village that produced so many footballers left almost nothing standing. Only the idea remained. Matt Busby came from Orbiston, a mining village in Lanarkshire. He was born in 1909, and his father was killed in the Great War when Matt was 6. The family moved. The houses were small. The money was scarce. Football was the field beyond all of that. He played for Manchester City and then Liverpool, a graceful and thoughtful wing-half who understood the geometry of a match as a kind of slow reasoning. When the game ended, he did not stop thinking about it. He began to think about it from the other side, from the bench. Manchester United appointed him manager in 1945. The ground had been bombed. There was very little of anything. He rebuilt from the foundations, and the thing he built was built on a particular belief that young players, given time and care and the right football, would become something greater than the sum of their parts. The Babes, they were called, the young players who came through in the 1950s. Busby found them, shaped them, gave them a style of play that was inventive and flowing. The country watched them and felt something that went beyond club loyalty, something like admiration for an idea. Munich happened in 1958. The aircraft on the runway, 8 of the young players gone, Busby himself nearly gone, twice given the last rites. The grief was not just a football grief, it was larger than that. And yet he came back to rebuild again because that was what he was. The 1968 European Cup final was the end of a 10-year journey that had started in the snow and wreckage of a runway. Busby sat on the bench at Wembley and watched the team he had built a second time complete what the first team had been pointing toward. He cried afterwards. Of course he did. What he carried from Orbiston to the great stages of European football was the same thing Shankly carried from Glenbuck. A belief that football was serious work, that it rewarded thought, that it belonged to the people who gave themselves to it without reservation. Jock Stein grew up in Burnbank, Hamilton, another Lanarkshire town with coal beneath it. His father was a miner. He became a miner too, working underground at Bothwell Castle Colliery while playing part-time football on the weekends. The two lives ran in parallel for years. He was not a spectacular player. He was steady and intelligent, a centre-half who read the game carefully and organised those around him. The organising was the thing. Even then, even in his 20s, people noticed how he thought, not just about his own position, but about the whole shape of the match. Celtic signed him in 1951 as cover. He was not expected to become a first-choice player. He became an essential one, and when his playing days ended, he moved quickly into management, first at Dunfermline, then at Hibernian, then back to Celtic in 1965. What he found at Celtic Park was talent without direction. He gave it direction. He gave it a belief in itself that the club had not felt for some years. And then he gave it Lisbon. The 1967 European Cup final was played in the Portuguese sunshine. Celtic faced Internazionale, the great defensive team of that era, a side built on discipline and containment and the careful conversion of draws into victories. Stein believed in something else. He believed in attacking football, in movement and width, and the courage to press forward even against the best. The players he sent out that afternoon in Lisbon were all born within 30 miles of Celtic Park. Miners' sons, shipyard sons, boys from the schemes. The records say Celtic won 2-1. The records say it is the first time a British club had won the European Cup. What the records cannot quite say is what it felt like in Lisbon as the light fell and the stadium slowly emptied and the men from Lanarkshire and the East End of Glasgow understood what they had done. Stein walked off the pitch that evening into the warm air of the city, and he carried with him something that had started in a colliery town in Lanarkshire. The idea that the game could be played a certain way, that the right way to play it was to think, to move, to pass, to trust the man beside you. He managed Scotland too for the last years of his working life, and he died in 1985 at the end of a World Cup qualifying match in Cardiff. He had been working until the last minute. He had not been doing anything other than what he always did, thinking about the game. Alex Ferguson was born in Govan in 1941. The shipyards were 2 streets away. His father worked at Fairfields. His brother worked at Fairfields. The river was always close, and the work on the river shaped everything. The hours, the wages, the expectation that you showed up and did what needed doing. He played for several clubs, St Johnstone among them, Dunfermline Rangers. He was a centre-forward, a direct and determined one, not the most gifted, but among the most driven. The drive was Govan. The drive was watching men go to work in the cold before dawn and come back tired and do it again. He went to East Stirlingshire in 1974 as a manager. He was 32. The club was small and under-resourced, and he worked with what he had. Then Aberdeen. Then, in 1986, Manchester United. What he brought to management was Govan sharpened into method. The belief that standards were non-negotiable. The belief that young players were worth the investment of time and attention. The belief that winning was the obligation you owed to the people who came through the gates. The style of play was direct and purposeful, but it was not graceless. It was grounded in the same tradition, the same understanding that football was a collective art, that the team which thought together moved together, that the pass was the basic unit of intelligence on a pitch. He managed Manchester United for nearly 27 years. The trophies are a long list. They are not the point or not the whole point. The point is the continuity, the unbroken line from Orbiston and Glenbuck and Burnbank and Govan back to the back streets of Glasgow, and the first men who decided the game should be played with thought. These were not four separate stories. They were one story told in different voices, in different towns, across the same Lanarkshire and Clydeside landscape. The same cold dust in the air, the same belief that the game was serious, that intelligence was a form of strength, that passing was not caution but conviction. A small country produced them, a country of fewer people than many single cities, a country that sometimes struggled to believe in itself, a country that had spent its best energy in other people's services and other people's wars. And yet from its back fields and its mine villages, it sent out men who changed the way the world's most popular game was thought about. The Scotch Professors taught the technique. These four men carried the philosophy, the idea that football was not an exercise in size or spectacle, but in cooperation, in trust, in the willingness to make your teammate better than you found him. Glasgow is quieter now than it was in the years of the mills and the yards. The Clyde is there, as it always was, moving west through the city in the dark. The old terracing at some of the grounds has come down and been replaced. The game has changed in its surfaces and its speed and its money. But go to any training ground in Britain on a Tuesday morning in November and watch what happens on the small-sided pitches. Watch the short pass and the movement off the ball. Watch the players working the angles, finding the spaces, trusting the system. You are watching something that started in the 1870s in the south side of Glasgow. It began as an experiment in cooperation. A group of young men in a park deciding that the individual should serve the team, that the game should be played with the mind as well as the body. They had no way of knowing what they were starting. The tradition passed from those early clubs to the men who played for them, to the men who carried the style abroad, to the communities of Glasgow who built their Saturdays around it, to the managers who grew up watching and thinking, and finally stepping forward to add their own chapter. Each generation handed something on, not always in words, mostly in example, in the way a man conducted himself on a training pitch or in a team talk, in the way he spoke about the game to the young players who came after him. The rain is falling on the Lanarkshire hills tonight. The colliery villages are mostly gone, their names kept now by road signs and memorial stones. The men who played on those pitches are long gone too. The game they made is still here. Glasgow at 2 in the morning is very still. The streets around the old grounds are empty. A lamp catches the wet cobblestones on a side street near the river. The city breathes slowly in the dark, its long history pressed into the stone of its buildings. Somewhere in this city, a boy will be born who will play football in ways we cannot yet predict. He will have no idea that the pass he makes almost without thinking carries the memory of 150 years of people thinking carefully about exactly that pass. The Clyde moves through the city in the dark and reaches the sea before morning. The sea does not know or care what it carries. History is like that. It moves without announcing itself. The great managers are gone now, or retired, or remembered in the particular way that football remembers its own. With warmth, with argument, with the occasional silence that means something was real and is missed. Shankly went back to Liverpool, people say, in the years after he retired, to watch training, to stand near the thing he had built, because he did not quite know what he was without it. The game was not something he did, it was what he was. Busby in his later years was a gentle presence at Old Trafford, white-haired, moving carefully, the weight of what he had built and lost, and rebuilt settled into something that looked like peace. He died in 1994. The statue outside the ground captures the stillness of him. Stein is remembered at Celtic Park and in Burnbank and in Lisbon, where a small community of Scottish supporters still mark the anniversary of that evening with something that is more than football. He would have found that excessive. He was not a man who liked a fuss. Ferguson retired in 2013. He had spent nearly 4 decades making young men better at football and better at understanding what effort meant. Govan was always in there somewhere. The shipyard ethic, the belief that nothing was given, that everything worth having had to be earned at the start of every week. The episode could end anywhere. It could end with the European night in Lisbon, or with Shankly at Anfield on a grey Tuesday, or with a boy in Glenbuck kicking a ball against a wall in 1920, while the colliery turns slowly in the background. It ends instead here, with Glasgow in the dark, because that is where it started. The city asleep, the river moving, the old grounds standing in their neighborhoods, the grass of the pitches holding the morning dew. A small nation looked at a game and decided to think about it differently. What came from that decision is still unfolding. The thread is still running. It has not broken yet. Let that settle as you rest. The story of Scotland and football is long, and it is not finished. The next part of it, the years when the game grew complicated and the national team took its own long road, waits for us in the next episode. But that is for another night. For now, let the managers sleep in their Lanarkshire towns. Let the old grounds stand quiet in the rain. Let Glasgow breathe in the dark. This has been Tartan Lullaby. Good night. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. The story is finished, but the night isn't, so let this play on as long as it helps. If Tartan Lullaby has been good company, you're welcome to subscribe so the next story finds you. There's no rush. If you'd like to see the landscapes that go with these stories, the art prints are at Tartan Lullaby Art on Etsy, with mood boards and stills on Pinterest under the same name. The links are in the description below. Until next time, thank you for listening. Sleep well, all is well.